Well, good morning. Welcome back to the Mishkan Katan studio. It's a privilege to have you with me each week as we get together and study the things of God. I appreciate the fact that you're willing to devote an hour of your time to coming here and studying with me at Mishkan Katan. Now, when we first began here on the Lamb Messianic Network, and I thank the Messianic Lamb Network for giving me the opportunity to be here and teach. When I first began here, I was doing the book of Ruth. And then, as my calendar would have it, I had a trip to Israel planned. And so I pre recorded 4 teachings in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which ran while I was gone. And then last week, the first Wednesday I was back here in the studio, I had the opportunity to tell you about my trip. And I enjoyed that very much. And when we were last together, I told you about days 1 and 2 of my trip. And so today we're going to continue that, and we're going to talk together about day 3 and day 4. And we'll see if we get through day 4. Last week, we did 2 days, so I don't know. I haven't really timed these particular teachings. I'm just talking about Israel and how much I love the country. And so we're just going to see how far we get. All right. So on day 3, just to recap a little bit, when we got into the country in Tel Aviv, we spent the first night, which was actually day 2, because day 1, you lose a day when you go over there. And so we spent the night in Tel Aviv. And then the very next day, we left to go to our home base for the next 5 or so days. And that was Kibbutz Lavi, which is in the Galilee. So on day 3, we left from Kibbutz Lavi and we went up into the Golan Heights. So I want to show you where that is on this map. Now, remember, I'm spectacularly bad at showing you things because everything is backward. And so I always want to go in the wrong direction. All right. So you can see almost the whole country here. And the more I try to fix it, the worse it gets. So I'm going to just try to hold it steady here. All right. The Golan Heights is right here, this darker brown area, that little blue area that you see right there, that is the Sea of Galilee. And a lot of Yeshua's ministry was up here around the top of the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. All right. Now, our first stop for the day in the Golan Heights was right about here, a place called Gamla. Gamla, it's spelled Gamla. And so that's where we began. Oh, that makes me dizzy to do that, honest to goodness. But Gamla was a very interesting place. I had never heard of it really before this trip, but it's a nature reserve. We went to see another nature reserve while we were in the country, but this one is a nature reserve that until recently was not even available for tourists like me. It was open to native Israelis and people with Israeli citizenship, but not to tourists, not to the general public. Now, this park was the site of a major battle in what is called the Great Jewish Revolt. Now, what on earth is that, you might ask? Well, after the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua in year 30 CE, about 33 years after that, the Great Jewish Revolt took place. That was an uprising of the Jewish people against the Romans, an effort to overthrow the Romans. And ultimately, the Romans were triumphant in that. And some of you may be familiar with some other landmarks in the Great Jewish Revolt. One of those occurred 4 years after it began in 70 CE when the temple was destroyed. And then The last major battle of that revolt took place at a place called Masada, which I'll speak with you about later on because we visited there in our journey, in our trip. And that took place, I believe it was around 73 CE. So even after Jerusalem fell, the Jews continued to fight to try and regain their homeland. But in Gamla, there was a major battle. And of course, this battle was between the Jews and the Romans. And Gamla was named after the third letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is Gimel. And Gimel, if you look at the letter Gimel, it looks kind of like this. Well, you can't see because of it looks kind of like this. It looks kind of like somebody walking. And it also, in the Paleo Hebrew, which is an earlier form of Hebrew, it looked like the hump of a camel. And when you see the mountain, Har Gimel, or Har Gamla, excuse me, it looks like a camel hump. Now, let me pause just a second. Remember, if you want to see pictures that go along with what I'm speaking with you about in this series, go to Facebook and go to Resplendent Daughter Ministries Facebook page, because that is the place where I posted all of my pictures from the trip. And the ones that I'm talking about right now are day 3. So you can go there and you can see a picture of Har Gamla, the Mount of Gamla, where this battle took place. And that's true for all of these teachings and sharings. You might better say sharings than teachings. And you'll be able to see the pictures which go along with everything. And I've got them labeled. So I would suggest that, if you're watching on an iPad or you're watching on a computer, just grab your phone and go to Facebook, go to Resplendent, go to your little search icon up here, go to Resplendent Daughter Ministries. Okay, it looks like this. All right. Has an open Bible with a ring on it. And you can scroll down. And I have some other things on there that I've shared. And the most recent ones are day 14. And you just have to scroll on down to day 3. And you'll find my day 3 photos. All right. So here we go. Day 3. Photos day 3. They look like that. All right. So you can just click on them. And I would show you, I would show them to you on the camera, but as I said, I'm spectacularly bad at this, showing you things on camera. But here's one of Gamla, all right? And you can see that it looks like the hump of a camel, right? That's Gamla. Very steep precipices there. Okay, now at the base of that steep mountain there are 2 rivers, one on either side of the mountain, and both of these rivers flow into the Kinneret, which English-speaking believers know better as the Sea of Galilee. This location in the Golan Heights, as I have mentioned, was a major battle in the Great Jewish Revolt. And one of the places I shared with you about last week was Caesarea. And the Great Jewish Revolt began in Caesarea. It spread to Jerusalem, to Jerusalem, and then on up to the north. Of course, the Golan Heights is in the north. Now, the man that was sent north, this is a very interesting fact, in my opinion. The man that was sent north to command the Jewish forces was a man whose name you might recognize. His name was Josephus, Flavius Josephus. We know him today mainly as Josephus, the famous Jewish historian. And let me tell you a little bit about Josephus, just a little nutshell. All right. Josephus, yes, he was sent forth to be the commander of the Jewish forces in the north during the Great Jewish Revolt. And essentially, he defected. He essentially defected to the Romans. So that made him lower than cow poo to the Jews, of course. But, if he had not lived to see another day, we would not have so much information about Jewish life in the first century. He was an incredible historian. And so we have so much. It's not scripture, of course. It's along the lines of the Mishnah and the Talmud, commentary, additional information about the Holy Scriptures. But what a wonderful resource the writings of Josephus are. So he was a general in the Jewish forces who defected to the Romans. All right, enough about him for the moment. All right, during the battle, the Romans were dressed in this very heavy chainmail, very heavy stuff. And they were trying to scale this mountain to get to the settlement. The settlement was up toward the peak of the mountain, built on the upper slopes of the mountain. And the Romans were at a severe disadvantage. And our tour guide told us that more Romans died of dust asphyxiation than died from actual battle wounds during this battle. But the sheer numbers of Romans overwhelmed the numbers of Jews there at the Gamla settlement. In the end, many Jews leapt to their deaths rather than surrender and be prisoners of the Romans. And this, you'll see that theme come up later. Remember that. At Gamla, they just leapt off the precipices of the mountain to their deaths rather than surrender and serve the Romans. And in the end, more than 9,000 people died. It was a very bloody battle. Well, this is another interesting point. Also, there at Gamla, there is a vulture conservation program. Now you're thinking, what? The griffin vultures, it's a breed of vulture that is native to this Galilee, this North Galilee area, and it nearly went extinct thanks to the Syrians. Now, it would be this variety of vulture, it's theorized, or a close cousin, that will eat the bodies of the dead after the Battle of Armageddon. Now, why is this believed to be so? Because they're native to the area. Look with me, if you have your Bibles, look with me at Revelation 19. Revelation 19 is a passage, verse 19 of chapter 19, that talks about the beast, the false Messiah, the Antichrist, as he's so called, and the kings of the earth with their armies who assembled to wage war on the plains of Megiddo, which is Armageddon, wage war against the one seated on the horse and against his army. Now, the one seated on the horse, it's a capital O, is Yeshua, our King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who will come back and fight this final battle against the false Messiah at Megiddo. So if you ever wondered about, can't imagine that you would, but maybe some of you have, ever wondered about these vultures that would eat the dead, here we go, the griffin vulture. And just as the Lord God is restoring the land in so many other aspects, he is restoring the griffin vulture native to that area so that when it's time for these flesh eaters to do their thing, they'll be numerous and they'll be able to do that. Now, these vultures are humongous. There was a model of one that was suspended over us there at this nature reserve under this pavilion. And they're not black and gray like the vultures that we see here. We call them buzzards here in the southeastern United States. They're not that coloration. They're a golden color, a beautiful golden color. and kind of a goldish beige. And we did get to see one that was in a rehabilitation cage. And some of us saw one flying around, but I didn't get to see one while we were there at Gamla. Now, there are basalt rocks all over this part of Israel. If you don't know what a basalt rock looks like, it's a dark charcoal gray, blackish lava type rock. And in Jerusalem, in the area of Jerusalem, you don't see that kind of rock. You see more limestone in Jerusalem. But there was a Christian church that was built at Gamla between the 4th and 5th centuries CE, and a monastery was built there in the 6th century with a surrounding village, although the village was abandoned in the 7th century. And in the wake of the Arab conquest of this locality, it was inhabited again in the 13th and 14th centuries. And after a time gap, a Syrian village was established there during the 20th century. But after the Six-Day War in 1967, during which time Israel regained control of the Golan Heights, then that Syrian village was abandoned after that time. So now it's uninhabited. And I posted a Facebook picture of a cool lizard that I saw at Gamla. These suckers are actually more like bearded dragons than they are what you might think of as a lizard. Okay, I'm going to try to show you some pictures. I'm not really sure how this comes out, but you see us down there, and you see the huge griffin vulture above us. Okay, so there's that. This is going pretty well. I might show you some more pictures. But I have a picture that I took of a lizard that I saw there. And I don't know if I posted it here or not on the Facebook page. But I don't see it there. But if I find one, I'll post it later. I know I made one. In fact, I made more than one because they're pretty numerous. But anyway, your world isn't going to end if you don't see a lizard. So anyway, from there, we went to a winery. Now, I'm not much of a drinker at all. I very rarely imbibe. I'm married to a teetotaler for very good reason. And so I very rarely imbibe. But one of our stops was at a winery in the Golan Heights. And on the way there, our tour guide told us the story of a super spy for Israel. His name was Eli Cohen, Cohn, Cohen, and he is an Israeli hero. His role was instrumental in the Six-Day War, and sadly, he was found out and he was executed by the lead commander of the Syrians. But before that happened, he had given tremendously excellent information, which helped Israel win the Six-Day War. He got very close to the Syrian commander, and so it really offended personally the Syrian commander when he found out that Cohen was a spy, a double spy. And so, he saw it as a personal betrayal and was like, kill him. Well, let me share with you one aspect of what Cohen did. He was a fascinating patriot. And if you want to learn more about him, let me recommend a book to you. It's called Our Man in Damascus. And really excellent book about him. But at any rate, the Israelis needed help in locating the Syrian bases. So Cohen helped with that. In Katzrin, the capital city of the Golan Heights at that time, Cohen convinced the Syrian commander to plant eucalyptus trees outside the base buildings for the Syrian soldiers to sit under during their free time, where it would be cooler. And this would be places for them to sit in the shade at picnic tables and talk and play checkers and eat and so forth. And at that time, there were not many trees in the area, especially not eucalyptus trees, as there are today. And eucalyptus trees are native to Australia. So the Israeli military, using their surveillance devices, even in 1967, had no trouble locating the eucalyptus trees. And so, therefore, those were the sites that got bombed. The Israelis ended up winning a decisive victory in part because of Eli Cohn and his eucalyptus trees. Now, after the 6 Day War, the Israelis began to build their own tanks. And interestingly enough, the Israeli tanks were the first air conditioned tanks. The first tanks also that can roll over sand dunes without sinking. And Israel doesn't sell the technology of this tank to any country in the world with good reason. All right, so back to the winery. Some of you are like, wait a minute, you mentioned a winery and then you started talking about Eli Cohn. All right, back to the winery. In the 1970s, California visitors came to the Golan Heights winery, and they said that this would be a great place to grow grapes because the climate was perfect. It had volcanic, well-drained soil. It had the Mediterranean climate, ooh la la, hot summers and cold winters. And the Golan Heights has the coldest winters in Israel. In fact, they have a ski resort up there in northern Israel on Mount Hermon, or some pronounce it Hermon. Mount Hermon has a wonderful ski resort, so they say. I'm not a skier. I don't ever plan to go to another ski resort, probably because I was a dismal failure at learning to snow ski. My family can tell you. At any rate, cold winters in the Golan Heights and high elevations. So at the lower elevations, I learned, they grow the grapes that they use to make the sweeter wines. And at the higher elevations, the drier wines with higher acidity. And they grow over 21 types of grapes at the GHW, the Golan Heights Winery. It takes from 3 to 7 years to harvest from new grapevines. And the winery is owned by 8 villages in the area. So it's kind of like a co-op, which I think is really great. Reminds me a little bit of a kibbutz, the concept of a kibbutz. But at any rate, it employs 6 winemakers headed by the chief winemaker, who has been with them for over 30 years. And there are a total of 110 workers there, all of them Jewish. The winery produces 4 different labels. So if you do like to drink wine and you're interested in getting some wine from the Golan Heights Winery, they have 4 different labels. Their most basic label is the Hermon, Hermon, and they have a fabulous Moscato that is a sweet wine. It's wonderful as a dessert wine or as a Shabbat wine. It's a white wine. And then they have the Golan wines, which are red wines. And then they have the Gamla wines, which if you're in America and you're looking for the Gamla wines, in America, they're called the Gilgal wines. There was a trademark issue in America. So if you're looking for that wine in America, look for Gilgal. And the Gilgal red wine is aged up to 6 months. And then there's the Yarden wine, which is a Jordan River wine. And those wines are aged for a year and a half. So the Yarden is the most expensive because the longer you age the wine, the more expensive it is. They make a sparkling wine using the champagne method, but it can't be called champagne because it does not come from the Champagne region of France. And in order to be called a champagne wine, it has to come from that region. There are over 300 computer-controlled, temperature-controlled tanks. And I have some pictures on my Facebook page of the winery. They only use their barrels for 5 years, and then they sell those barrels to a nearby whiskey company. And they only use French oak barrels, and they have over 12,000 of them. So it's a big operation. We saw the barrels in what's called the barrel hall, and there's a picture of that over Facebook and on Facebook. And from one barrel, they get 300 bottles of wine. And the barrel hall is only for the red wines that they make. You can see in the picture the spillage on the outside of the barrel, because they have to have spillage because they can allow no air inside the barrel. So the only way to make sure there's no air in the barrel is to let it spill over and then cap it. So it's a tricky task, and the topping off of the barrel and the corking, and I have pictures of a mallet and some corks on the Facebook page, it's done by hand. And so the barrel corker people, they crawl up onto the tops of these barrels with their mallets and their corks, and they cork them. And the winery has its own rabbi named Rabbi Shalom. Shalom means peace, of course, and he certifies all the wines as kosher. So if you're looking for delicious kosher wines, consider the Golan Heights Winery. So after leaving the winery, we stopped in a little town called Katan. I mentioned it earlier. It was the capital of the Golan Heights, and that's the town the winery is in. Well, from there, we went to Mount Bental. We passed by Mount Avital, its twin peak. And if you know Hebrew, Ben in Hebrew means son of, and Avi means my father. So you've got the son mountain and you've got the father mountain, okay? And both of these mountains are peaks of an ancient volcano. The resulting ash from the times the volcanoes have erupted makes the land in the valley below an agricultural paradise. So there is a large agricultural enterprise there. And today, Mount Avital is a significant Israeli military base. And for that reason, we did not go there for a visit. We didn't have the security clearance to go up on Mount Avital. All right. But at Mount Bental, we hiked around the summit, from which there's a magnificent view. I made a couple of videos, and I don't know if I posted those on my Facebook page or not. I said I was going to try to, but I don't remember if I actually did. But we were able to see the Syrian border and over into Syria. We were also able to get a great view of Mount Hermon and see into the country of Lebanon. Because remember, we were right up there at the northern border. And most importantly, we were able to see the Valley of Tears, where the great decisive battle of the Yom Kippur War of 1973 was fought. The Valley of Tears was the location where the Barak Brigade was wiped out in the Yom Kippur War. This offensive took out most of the Israeli officers, leaving only the untried young 18 and 19-year-old boys to get things done. I highly recommend to you Abraham Rabinovich's book on the Yom Kippur War, if you want to read about that miraculous war. Well, both the 1967 Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War were miraculous works of Father Yahweh on behalf of his chosen people, and they were instrumental in establishing the nation of Israel. Now, 30,000 people, Jewish people, live in the Golan Heights. 15,000, half of those, live in Katan, the largest city, the capital city, plus another 30,000 people live there who are called the Druze. I blogged about the Druze yesterday, and I talked with you about them in my last broadcast. So I want to elaborate more on them with you today. All right, Mount Hermon. When you look at my photo of this famous mountain, you can see snow caps on some of the peaks. The snow-capped peaks are on the Syrian side. Mount Hermon straddles Syria and Israel. The snow-capped peaks are on the right side of the photo, and the peaks to the left without the snow are in Israel. Mount Hermon is the only significant mountain in the Golan Heights that is made of limestone because, as I mentioned earlier, the primary rock in the area is basalt. The Bonias Springs, or Bonias, some people pronounce them, the Bonias Springs are at the foot of Mount Hermon, and that's where the Jordan River begins. And I'll tell you more about Bonias in a moment. But Mount Hermon was where Yeshua, in Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20, mentioned an attraction at the foot of the mountain. The city that in the New Testament is called Caesarea Philippi, which is not the same place as Caesarea by the sea. Now, I talked to you in the last broadcast about Caesarea by the sea, you know, where Herod had his palace and he built the port and had the amphitheater, all that. This is Caesarea Philippi, okay? It is in the north, okay, far north. And Caesarea Philippi is an ancient city at the base of Mount Hermon, all right? The Jewish name for the town is Bonias, and it's still called that today. Now, at this location, when the Romans were in control, they built a pagan shrine to the false god that they worshiped named Pan. You may remember Pan. He was, if you studied mythology in high school, he was a centaur. From the waist up, he was human man. From the waist down, he was a goat, I think. And he played this little flutish type pipe thing, okay? And so, you know, a demonic false god. But at any rate, the Romans just really thought highly of Pan. And so they built this shrine there. And it was built shortly before Jesus began his ministry. So he and his disciples went to this location. It was a beautiful temple. And some people even called the name of the place Panias instead of Bonias. But in Arabic, I'm told, there are no P sounds. So that's where Bonias came to be the name of it. And guess what the temple's nickname was? Are you ready for this? The nickname of this temple was the Gates of Hell. Now, think about that phrase. Where do you remember that phrase in the New Testament? The gates of hell. Well, I will tell you. Matthew 16, 13 through 20. Jesus is having a conversation with his followers, with his disciples, and he makes this statement, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Well, when he said it, he was at the gates of hell. Double meaning there, okay? The temple of Pan would not prevail against his bride, the body of Messiah, that literal false god, and the literal gates of hell would not prevail against it. See, I just love learning the context of Scripture because it gives you such a richer depth of meaning. Okay. It's also said that another famous incident occurred on Mount Hermon, on the summit. If you remember studying about the Abrahamic covenant, my pastor likes to talk about it being the cutting of a covenant. And the reason it was called cutting a covenant is because when the Lord God made that covenant with Abraham, he took a bull, and Abraham took the bull and he cut it down the middle. And then the presence of God in the presence of I believe it was like a censer, a flaming censer. It floated down between the two pieces of the animal. And so it's called cutting a covenant. All right. Okay. So that's the Abrahamic covenant. And it is said that is where that took place. Now, interestingly, the Syrian government, that part of Hermon is in Syria, and the Syrian government has restricted access to that place. So you can't go there unless, you know somebody in the Syrian government, which I imagine is none of my listeners. But at any rate, so you can't go there today. Sorry. No field trips to where the Abrahamic covenant was cut. All right. Now, on the way to biblical Bonias, we passed through a Druze village, and that was interesting. We passed through it again as we went to Tel Dan. Now, remember, Tel in Hebrew means mountain or hill or huge Indian mound or whatever. Any kind of raised geographic feature is called a tell. All right. And I think, let me just stop and say, I think we had trouble with something on Lamb's end for 2 or 3 minutes. So thank you for staying with me. It looks like it's back now. But at any rate, we're going to tell Dan now, after we leave the gates of hell. We're going to Tel Dan in the bus. And what a beautiful national park Tel Dan is. Oh my goodness. The most beautiful water we have seen so far on our trip was at the headwaters of the Dan River. And let me see if I have a picture of that on my Facebook page. Oh my goodness. It was just so beautiful. I love beautiful rushing water anyway. Here's a picture. Isn't that gorgeous? It reminds me of some of the waters in the Grand Canyon. But Tel Dan was a beautiful park. And I told one of our rabbis that the Dan River is what I imagined the Jordan River would look like before I came to Israel. But by the time the Dan flows into the Jordan, it's been significantly altered by silt and other factors, and that results in the Jordan being a muddier, more slow-flowing river. But at any rate, our guide showed us many, many black snails in the water of the Dan River. And why is this significant? He told us that these snails can only live in pure, potable drinking water. Their presence indicates that the water is good. Our guide mentioned that some American legacy has been good for Israel, but the American legacy of suing over every little thing is not part of that. Okay. In years past, visitors to the park could just enjoy the beautiful waters, but lawsuits have caused the government to prohibit visitors from getting into the waters except for one small, shallow pool. And today, or that day that we were there, we saw many school children on a field trip frolicking in the waters. It was a beautiful time that they were having. They were just having a blast. All right, further on up the mountain, we continued to hike on up. We were met with the 3,000-year-old ruins of the ancient city of Dan. Now, the tribe of Dan did not get this land only. They also were deeded or assigned some land down in the Tel Aviv area, interestingly enough. And in part of the remaining wall that we were able to see, you could see some wall construction that was 3,000 years old and other sections that were merely 2,000 years old. And it's a miracle that these gates survived as long as they did. But idol worshipers were not allowed inside these gates back when this was a functioning city called Dan. They were designed, the gates were, like other similar fortresses that you can still see in Israel, such as the Jaffa Gate in what's still today the old city of Jerusalem. And what I mean by that is you would start into the gate like this, and then the gate would suddenly make a 90-degree turn and go like this. And then again like this. And so they were designed this way in order to slow down marauding invaders, slow them down enough with their chariots so that the archers up above would be able to shoot them, or more effectively, pour vats of boiling oil down on top of them. Not kidding. So while we were there, we saw an area in the gates where the judges sat. You could see where seats were carved out of the stone. And one of our guides sat there and taught us as the judges would have sat. They would sit there inside the gates and they would handle civil matters and they would teach the people. And for scripture references for this, go look at Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Now, the story of Ruth took place in Bethlehem Ephratah, not in Dan, although Bethlehem is not that far from Dan. But another reference is 2 Samuel 19, verse 8. Now, also nearby were the ruins of the false temple of Jeroboam. Now, if you remember Jeroboam, okay, when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took his place. And Rehoboam was a fool. All right, he was a fool. Rehoboam decided that he was going to be even more cruel and harsh to the people than his father was. And so when he began to act in such an awful manner, Rehoboam had a brother named Jeroboam, and Jeroboam decided, I'm having none of this. So he convinced 10 of the Jewish tribes to basically secede from the Union. And they formed their own nation. And it was mostly the northern tribes. The only tribes that were not part of this secession were Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites. Now, the Levites didn't have a land allocation, but that's too much for me to go into. But the tribe of Levi, the tribe of Judah, and the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so Jeroboam was the first king of this illegitimate 10-tribe empire up there. And Jeroboam decided that it was not necessary for his people to travel to Jerusalem for the 3 Regalim festivals. Regalim means feet, and they're called the Regalim festivals because it was required that all Jewish men ages 2 years and up would travel to Jerusalem for those 3 festivals. They were Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. All right. And they were required to go. But Jeroboam says, nope, you don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore and worship there. You know what, folks? I'm going to build us a temple and you can come make your sacrifices here. And so he did that in Dan. Now, we didn't have the opportunity to hike up there to that temple. It was getting late. We had people in our party who were in their 70s and 80s. And the leaders of the tour just felt like it would be too rigorous for them to do that at this point in the day. So we didn't go see this first exhibit A of replacement theology. That's what Jeroboam was doing. He was instituting replacement theology, and that demonic theology is still prevalent today. We still see it today, and I won't get into that, but you know what I'm talking about, many of you. So at any rate, that was the ruins of Jeroboam's temple. And another wonderful site that you can see at Tel Dan is something called Abraham's Gate. This was our last stop for the day, that day. It was one of the northern gates into the city of Dan. And it's theorized that this gate, or a gate very much like it, was the one that Abraham came through when he journeyed from Ur in Mesopotamia all the way down into the promised land. Have you ever asked yourself, well, where did Abraham enter the promised land? Well, he was coming from the northeast, so likely he entered through a gate in the area of Dan, the northernmost province. So Abraham's gate was made out of the same material that the Egyptian pyramids are made out of, and it's very durable, mud and straw. And you would think, oh my word, how in the world has this survived? Well, it's survived 4,000 years. So it's quite ancient. It was discovered This is an amazing story. God is just so amazing. It was discovered in the 1960s when the Jewish people who had settled in Dan. Now remember, you had the war in 1967, right? The 6-Day War, which returned to Israel this area in the Golan Heights. So the Jewish people, as you know, the Syrians had to leave. The Jewish people came up there, and some of them petitioned the government to let them plant orchards of mango trees and avocado trees in order to have an income to sustain the people who made a kibbutz there, the community there, Kibbutz Dan. And in the excavation that was required for planting the trees, they discovered this ancient gate. It was literally underground, which is one of the reasons why it's been preserved. It's and so also uh, Abraham in the battle of the 5 kings, when he participated in that battle, the 5 kings against the 4 kings. If you remember, the scriptures tell us he chased the enemy all the way to Dan. So he could definitely have passed through this gate when he did that. I think it's one of the greatest architectural treasures in Israel because it's so old. And in Psalm 102, we read, "My people love their stones." And why? Why do they love their stones? Because their stones tell their story. Let me see if I have a picture of Abraham's gate to show you here from this particular day. It's really magnificent. But here we go. All right, now they've got, as you look at it, they've got a cover over it. Do you see that cover?
richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.